All right, let's talk about Chapter 8, Basic Experiments. At the end of today's lecture, you should be able to describe the relationship between what is called a confounding variable and the internal validity of an experiment. You should be able to describe the post-test-only design and something called the pretest post-test design, including the advantages and disadvantages of each of these designs. You should also be able to contrast an independent groups design with the repeated measures design. And finally, you should be able to summarize the advantages and disadvantages of using a repeated measures design. Now, I realize I've just basically have listed a number of terms that may be very confusing to you, but we'll go through each of these, so don't feel disheartened. So up to now, we've been covering non-experimental research, again, the fundamental basis of which is collections of behavior. Some of these are existing records of behavior. Some of this is behavior or that occurs in natural settings. And then finally, we take a while to cover self-report behavior in the form of surveys and interviews. But today we're embarking on the last phase of the class, which is experimental research. And in experimental research, it's very important to know that the researcher is manipulating a variable, which is called the independent variable, to test its effects on another variable, which is called the dependent variable, or as I have listed here, DV. The other important thing to remember about experimental research is that in this type of research, all extraneous variables are controlled. So we try to control everything else going on to make sure that it is truly the variable that we manipulate, the independent variable, that is truly leading to changes in the dependent variable that might be observed. So here's an example. Let's say that we were interested in examining the relationship between crowding in a room and its effects on cognitive performance on some task. And let's say further that we were going to manipulate the variable of crowding, which is our independent variable, where you see above here you have no crowding and a lot of crowding. So we're going to manipulate the variable crowding, our independent variable, where there is no crowding or little crowding and lots of crowding. And let's say that we actually find that on cognitive performance, and let's say it's just some sort of task where we ask people to memorize something or something and to recall some information, that people in the uncrowded or less crowded condition, that their performance is 71, the mean there, versus 60 over here. So let's say that we actually do see a difference, okay? Can we say that the difference in scores is related to the difference in crowding? Now think about that. We can if there are no other differences between the groups. So let's explore that a little bit more. So let's say that in one of the rooms, the room with less crowding, there is a window or windows. And let's say that in the room that has lots of crowding, there isn't a window. So in this case, in this scenario, it's impossible to know whether or not the lower scores of the people in the crowded room were actually due to crowding or the lack of windows. And so again, remember, in experimental research, we try to control all extraneous variables. So we would want to make sure that the rooms either all had windows or all didn't have windows, so we could say that the lower scores were not due to another variable. So in this case, what we're saying is that crowding, that variable crowding, is confounded with windows. And a confounding variable is simply a variable that varies along with the independent variable, and in this case that's crowding. So confounding occurs when the effects of the independent variable, our crowding variable, and an uncontrolled variable, in this case the windows, are intertwined, okay? And you can't tell which variable is responsible for the effect. So in our case, we can't tell whether or not the lower scores on cognitive performance are due to the fact that there is crowding in the room or due to the fact that there is no window in the room and the fact that there is a window in the uncrowded room. So the window variable was not kept constant, and so we don't know whether or not the window or the crowding was responsible for the change in scores. So in experimental research, all extraneous or confounding variables are controlled. And because of that, we are more assured of internal validity, okay? In other words, we are more confident that the changes to the dependent variable can be attributed to the changes or the manipulations that we have made with the independent variable. So let's move on and talk about the basics of experiments. So the simplest experiment has two variables, an independent variable and a dependent variable. So the simplest experiment with only two variables with the lowest levels of independent variable has simply an experimental group and a control group. And again, the researcher's goal is to make sure that the only difference between the independent variable and these two groups here, the experimental group and the control group, is the manipulated variable. And in that example that we had earlier, it would be crowding. So there are a couple of different ways that experimenters can exercise control. One is experimenter control, in which all variables are kept constant, okay? The other way is through randomization, and that is where we randomly assign participants to make sure that extraneous variables affect both groups equally. Now, randomization is really key because it's impossible to sometimes control all of the different things going on in a room. We can't control the weather, we can't control windows, we can't control every single thing going on, and we certainly can't control age, gender, ethnicity, and any sort of variable, demographic variables that I might list there, because those are things that an experimenter has no control over. But when you randomly assign people and you have a sufficiently high number of individuals who are in different groups, you basically have those effects are equaled out across the groups. There are two forms of basic experiments. One is the post-test only, and then the other is a pre-test post-test design. And it sounds complicated, but it really is not too bad. In the post-test only design, the researcher first obtains two equivalent groups of participants through random assignment. They introduce the independent variable, and then they measure the effect of the independent variable on the dependent variable. So let's take a look at that. So to obtain equivalent groups, again, the experimenter is going to randomly assign participants either to the experimental group or the control group, and then they're going to measure its effects on the dependent variable. So again, we might have had a lot of crowding versus no crowding, and again, experimentally, we're going to randomly assign folks to these different groups, and then we're going to measure its effects on cognitive performance using our same example. So again, participants must be assigned to result in equivalent groups to eliminate any selection differences. So, for example, you can't have all college-educated people in one group and non-college educated individuals in the other. Or, vice versa, you couldn't have all females in one group versus all males in another group, or all older individuals in one group versus younger people in another group. Because again, if you did, the variables would be confounded with the independent variable, and we wouldn't know whether or not the results that we found, the changes in the dependent variable, were due to the manipulated independent variable or due to the selection differences. So with the pre-test and the post-test design, the only difference is that a pre-test is given before this experimental manipulation is introduced. So we would introduce a pre-test, and we do this to make sure that the groups are equivalent in the beginning of the experiment. This is not necessary if the participants have been randomly assigned to two groups, and with large samples, and usually that's about 30 people, random assignment usually produces groups that are almost identical. But let's say we want to make sure that we don't have groups where we have more people who are more anxious than in another group. So we might actually introduce a pretest that measures anxiety and then assign people to groups. So pretests, there are advantages and disadvantages to using pretests. The advantage is that a pretest is useful with small samples when randomization is not possible. So if you have less than 30 people, you're going to want a pretest. And you can measure the extent of change. And you also can look at mortality effects. So for example, let's say we were interested in looking at a smoking cessation experiment where individuals sign up and they agree to participate in an experiment where we are looking at whether or not we can help them to quit smoking. And we see that some people drop out, okay? And let's say that some of the smokers in there are really heavy smokers, and some of them are really light smokers, and we're looking at the extent of change. And let's say that some of the people who dropped out were the ones who were really heavy smokers. Well, we don't know if the treatment that we used was actually effective, because we have some people who dropped out of the study who were heavy smokers. And so when you measure them at the end, it may look like, yes, there's been a reduction in smoking, but if we have seen that a lot of heavy smokers have left the study, we don't have much information there. The disadvantage to a pretest is because you're actually introducing more tests, that it's time consuming, and it potentially can sensitize participants to what you're actually studying. So if people figure out, oh, they're trying to measure how anxious I am, I might want to change my behavior. One of the ways that we can address that is that we can disguise it in irrelevant measures. So let's talk about assigning participants to experimental conditions. There are two different ways that we can do this. One is independent groups design, and then the other is something we call repeated measures design. With independent groups design, the different participants are assigned to each of the conditions just using random assignment. So, and there are lots of different ways that you can do that. You can simply use a random numbers to individuals and randomly assign people, or you might use a birth date, and anyone's whose birth date ends in an odd number is in one group and evens would be in another group. It helps to prevent any systematic biases, and again, the groups will be equivalent in terms of participant characteristics such as income, intelligence, age, or other variables. The repeated measures design, by contrast, or in contrast, is a situation where participants are repeatedly measured on the dependent variable after being in every condition or every level of the independent variable of the experiment. So repeated measures design, the advantage is that, again, if you have a small number of participants, it's hard to randomly assign them, and so you'll need fewer research participants. And it's sensitive to finding statistically significant differences between groups, okay? So in other words, you're going to be able to see changes across individuals. So for example, let me explain or illustrate that advantage. So imagine that we're interested in examining whether or not the meaningfulness of material that people are asked to read is related to the learning of that material. And so maybe meaningfulness has to do with maybe your major or something. So, and we use independent groups, okay, which is randomly assigning people. And let's say that this is the high meaningful condition, and these are the scores in terms of learning. And the scores range from 68 to 92. And in the low meaningful condition, where it doesn't relate to your major, the scores range from 64 to 85. Okay, the mean on the high meaningful condition is 80.3, and the mean in the low meaningful condition is 75.7. Okay, we see that the average recall in the high meaningful condition is higher. But if you also look at these numbers, you'll see that there's a lot of variability. So again, the scores range all the way from 68 to 92 and from 64 to 85. So not everyone in the high meaningful condition has high scores. So the average recall is a bit higher in the meaningful condition. But what we're seeing here is that there's a lot of differences, individual differences. And if you're able to look at these individual differences, you'll be able to see the range in both conditions. And the fact that you can't see this when we randomly assign people is part of error. So repeated measures is a good solution to addressing this. So repeated measures, again, is where we expose all individuals to all levels of the independent variable. So here we would say that all participants are going to be exposed to the high meaningful condition and the low meaningful condition. So participant 1 is exposed to the high meaningful condition, the low meaningful condition, and these are their scores, and what you see here in red is the change over time in their scores. So with the repeated measure design, we can see that individual differences can be seen and explained over time. But the disadvantage is that different conditions have to be presented in a particular sequence. So, for example, again, the average recall is a bit higher in the meaningful condition. But what if the fact that we see this higher result is because we simply presented the high meaningful condition in a particular order? Is it possible that the performance might be higher just because participants gain practice on the first task? Well, we can't rule that out, okay? So yes. So this is what leads to something called order effects, and that's when the order of presenting our independent variable, or the levels of the independent variable, affect the dependent variable. And there are different kinds of order effects. One is a practice effect, and this is where you see an improvement in performance as a result of repeating practice with a task. And that would be a good example of what we just saw with meaningfulness. And so because of the fact that people were exposed to the task again and again, they might have gotten better because of practice. Then there's something that we call a fatigue effect, and this is where you see a decrease in performance because the participant is repeatedly exposed to different levels of the independent variable, and because of that they become bored, tired, or distracted. A good example of this is someone who's asked to play a video game in 30-minute intervals for several hours under different reward conditions. Although, thinking about children in my household, I don't see them getting bored or distracted, but it's possible. And then finally there's the contrast effect. And this is when the response to the second condition in the experiment is altered because the two conditions are contrasted to one another. So what you see here as an example is, let's say that you're being asked to talk about the severity of a crime, but you're exposed to a much less severe crime first, and then they show you a severe crime, or you read about it, and it seems much worse just because you were exposed to the less severe crime first. So the fact that there's such a large contrast between one another leads you to believe that the second one is much more severe than if you hadn't been presented with the less severe crime first. So how do we deal with the fact that these order effects occur and lessen their effects on experiments? Well, we have two ways of dealing with it. One is to counterbalance, and the other is to introduce something that is a time interval. With complete counterbalancing, what we find is that all possible orders of the independent variable are included in the experiment. So here's an example. So in the first order, with our meaningfulness information, we have some participants who are in the low meaningfulness example first, or manipulation first. They're asked to recall, and then they're exposed to the high meaningfulness and that condition, and then they're asked to recall. Well, again, in order to completely counterbalance, we have half of the other participants who are exposed to the high meaningful condition first, and then, as you might guess, they're asked to recall, and then they're exposed to the low meaningfulness condition, and again asked to recall. With time intervals, what we do is we introduce, as the name implies, time between treatments and the measurement of dependent variables. So, for example, this is commonly used if an independent variable is a drug that takes time to wear off. If you are interested in studying the effects of marijuana on cognitive and motor task performance, you certainly, and you want to see the difference between smoking different levels of marijuana, you probably want to introduce some time in between the testing of the dependent variables. So they'll be tested before and after smoking, but you don't want to have people smoking too much marijuana before you ask them to be measured on that motor task performance. By the way, I found a funny little cartoon clip that says, marijuana, hey, at least it's not crack. I thought it was funny. Okay, let's talk about frequently occurring independent variables before we finish up. So when considering between repeated measures and independent groups, remember that some independent variables may be better suited for single or multiple occurrences, okay? So for example, if we're asking people how characteristics of a defendant affects jurors, it's probably best to use independent group design because in real life, jurors are only asked to look at one defendant at a time. So we don't want them to look at multiple numbers of defendants when they typically only see one. But on the other hand, if we're talking about asking people in an experiment to talk about or think about employer perceptions of job applicants, because employers are used to seeing multiple candidates, it would be okay to ask them to go through repeated measures and look at a number of different job applicants. And that's it for Chapter 8. I hope you learned a lot. I know we covered a lot of terms, but welcome to the world of basic experiments. I'll see you later. Take care.